My friends, the story of Michael Manley is not just the story of Jamaica. It is ours in the region, in the Caribbean, and it is ours in the global south. Let us not honor him with words. Let us make his vision our mission. Let us agree that there is a floor below which no Caribbean citizen should be allowed to go as we build out this region.
What's up, guys? Welcome to this channel once again. If you have not subscribed, kindly do so. Like this video, share it out, and also leave your sweet comments. So the Prime Minister of Barbados, that is Mia Mottley, was recently in Jamaica on the 10th of December 2024, and she delivered a very powerful speech. This is her speech before we come back and analyze and give more comments.
I am not the one to give you a historical treatise on all of the achievements of Michael Manley. But suffice it to say that in this small Caribbean, there are some things that stand out, if only because for too much of our history, our parliament was used as an instrument of oppression rather than a tool of enfranchisement and empowerment. That we have not even yet reached 100 years of being able to be firm craftsmen of our fate speaks volumes. But that we have, in this short period of time, been able to reverse aspects of our legislation that literally choked us and denied us the dignity of agency and the dignity of our humanity is a major, major accomplishment. In our case, it cut across many leaders. In yours, it did. But some of these things stand out purely because of the majesty of the legislative transformation and the social transformation. The repealing of the Master and Servants Act, an iniquitous piece of legislation that sought to bind us in as close to bonds of slavery without slavery being legal. The establishment of a national minimum wage, something that eluded many, many countries for many, many decades before you established it here. Maternity leave with pay, which we actually did slightly before you, but Michael Manley made sure that you did it. Gender equity and pay scales. Other laws, as we heard tonight, that outlawed bastardy, as we did too, around the same time. A law that established your National Housing Trust, I'm told, that transformed the fate of so many of your citizens. But it is not simply in the announcement and the passage and the recitation of these policies that it matters. It is also in the essence of the man, believing that fundamental to the building of a society is the dignity to be accorded to each and every citizen, to see, hear, and feel each and every citizen. And we take this sometimes for granted because the world in which we live doesn't even admit of it. Countries that are large sometimes don't see or feel small countries. The reality is that it is a rare, rare virtue. And for the last 6 years, I started to reflect on how much the world looked like 100 years ago. And that in truth and in fact, we are in the throes of an inflection point, a historic movement that really, really, today, causes us to have to pause. And the danger is that we might be at risk of being distracted from the fundamental things that truly make a difference to our planet and to our people, and by extension, to our Caribbean civilization. The reality is that what we are witnessing, in my view, is really the dying of an old order without yet seeing where the new order will be located and how it will be framed. The Italian philosopher Antonio Gramsci wrote in his famous prison notebooks, and I quote, "The old world is dying, and the new world struggles to be born. Now is the time of monsters," unquote. And what are those monsters today? Is it the climate crisis? I don't refer it to as climate change because there's nothing about change in the crisis that we face. It is a season of superlatives, and it's the season of the unexpected. We see it from the droughts, to the floods, to the hurricanes, to the sargassum seaweed, to so many other things that are so unrealistic. I'm accustomed to convection rain here in Kingston, not in Bridgetown. For the last 2 years, we experienced that from August to December, almost 5 days a week. While at the same time, for the first 6 months of last year, we had less than 50% rainfall of the average 30 years that went before, in the same year. The monsters are the pandemics. And we acknowledge that with the increased heat, we are likely to see new pathogens develop, and by extension, new pandemics are likely to emerge. But even as we speak, separate from that, our abuse of antibiotics, antimicrobials, has led to an extraordinary level of antimicrobial resistance that now makes that responsible for the third highest number of deaths directly and indirectly in the world, and by 2050, it shall be responsible for the highest volume of deaths in the world, reversing a century of medical progress and making simple things like going to the dentist or going in the garden or having a baby risky things if you get an infection. We have seen environmental degradation generally, but in particular degradation of our soils. And there is the belief that it will considerably impact the already threatened food security that we have as a result of the impact of climate itself. But soil degradation in and of itself will make it worse. We are seeing the collapse of ecosystems and the collapse of and further loss of biodiversity. Things that we were accustomed to seeing are finding themselves removed from our environment. And at the same time, globally, we have 35 million people, refugees, across the world, fleeing wars, violence, persecution, and abject poverty, right here in our own region to across the world. The world itself is a dangerous place to be. The 1st of December, France had a government, as did Syria. Today, the 10th of December, both have been gone for a few days. One by law and one by force. We are at an interesting point. We hear of the movement against incumbents more than anything else. Some of it expresses itself in right-wing populism, some of it in the UK, left of centre. But in both instances, it's an anti-incumbent move, largely because much of what people have had to experience in this polycrisis moment in the last 5 years has made life difficult for most and perplexing for all. The spectacle of fake news and the inability to control a narrative to build a nation, where broadcasting used to be the order of the day and now narrowcasting and echo chambers replace it. We have more than ever to determine what does love look like in this, the third decade of the 21st century. And because time limits me, I'll just address a few matters. One, as it relates to regional integration and foreign policy. 2, as it relates to the reform of the international financial system, and by extension, our capacity to meet the global public goods that are critical for our survival on the planet as people. And finally, the utter and absolute importance as Caribbean people of the psychological reinforcement of our cultural identity to give us purpose and to give us unity and solidarity to weather these difficult times as the New World Order finds itself emerging. May not be for a few decades, maybe as soon as the next 5-10 years. And it is slow upon us when all of a sudden, as we saw in Syria, it is immediately upon us. And that is the nature of the world in which we live today, where the powers that influence and the information that is generated goes way beyond the nation state. And to that extent, on this day of International Human Rights Day, one asks yourself, what will that new world order look like? And what will truly be the power of nation states? Will small states be able to survive without deep functional cooperation and pooling? Or will they become collateral victims as the world seeks to line up behind great powers yet again, particularly if the multilateral rules-based system that we have is not allowed to work for us? I say to you that it is critical that we not be sucked in to the bankruptcy of the current global world order. And if we go back to what love was for Michael Manley, and I'm amazed at the extent to which even the language used foretold the times in which we come to live in. There is no doubt that we are in a race against time. And those who doubt it will fail to prepare. And that, for us, means that we recognize that love fundamentally is about caring, seeing, hearing, and feeling. Fundamentally is about resilience, a word that Michael used more ahead of his time than most. And love is about transformation. We have taken long to do some of these things, not because of laziness, but because of the complexity of the root system that has caused us to be victims of another order that effectively took away from us identity and movement. And I dare say that so fundamental is the human resistance against that type of activity that I really believe that that is one of the reasons for the strong anti-incumbent movement globally, coming after 2 to 3 years of restricted movement and increased cost of living, where persons are trying to recoup losses in the shortest possible time from a pandemic, that has caused people to say, hey, you didn't see me for a few years, but watch me now, I'm here. And if you don't realize I'm here, I'm going to show you that I'm here. And we've seen it country by country by country by country. But if we come to understanding what that race to become resilient must look like, it is being thrown at us more than ever through the climate crisis. And that is why, in a very real sense, the global south, in its victimhood, has a renewed sense of solidarity, because we all know that we didn't cause the problem, and that in fact we are now bearing double jeopardy, because having been the beast of burden to enrich those who built the Industrial Revolution, we are now the first victims on the front line to the consequences of the Industrial Revolution in terms of greenhouse warming. And that solidarity is not in a vacuum, because at the same time that we seek to save ourselves from the climate crisis, you're asking us to divert critical capacity and financing away from the noble objectives of development as best captured in the Sustainable Development Goals. It is not on. And we can no longer move in one direction to fight climate, then we can move in the other direction alone to fight development and ignore climate. We must walk and chew. And it is a false dichotomy to ask people to choose between people and planet. The foreign policy, therefore, that we have has first and foremost today to reinforce that effort that Michael Manley brought to bear in bringing unity among the global south, the former colonies, to be able to define a policy and fiscal space that was sufficiently large to pursue the policies that would empower and enrich our people and accord to them the dignity that has always been theirs but was robbed because of the iniquitous institutions of slavery and colonialism and imperialism. We have, at this point, to recognize that that common purpose, and I have the honor to lead now the climate vulnerable countries of the world, otherwise known as the V20 group, which now embraces 70 countries from across Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean and Latin America, recognizing that our common purpose in fighting the battles against the climate crisis and finding the financing necessary to secure our way, and also conscious of the pathogens that may develop, because health can immediately trump anything if a pandemic hits us in the way that the last one did. These countries are no more different from the countries Michael Manley dealt with 50 years ago, but with few voices listening and few countries feeling. Mark Golden spoke earlier, and Prime Minister Patterson, about some of the common challenges. And the truth is that as we speak, we might have been the canaries in the mine, but the climate crisis has now literally crept in to the reality of the lives of those in the global north. Whether it is the wildfires in California and Canada and Europe, or it is the floods or the hurricanes, there is no part of Earth that is being exempt from it. And if we don't recognize that our primary purpose and gaze must be to fight this battle unless some people have a plan to live on Mars that we don't know about, then we will lose the battle. The reality is that there are diverging views, and we must take the world as we find it, not as we dream for. And if we are to do so, and I don't normally disagree with Prime Minister Patterson, I'm not trying to school the President-elect, but I'm conscious that while we may disagree as to the causes of the climate, we cannot disagree as to the reality of disaster. And in a very real sense, our love of planet requires of us to have mature conversations that may respect the differences of what brings us to each point, but to find the commonalities for progress to be achieved, because the climate crisis is not waiting on any of us as it unleashes its furor on the world. Against that backdrop, I have said recently and repeat that if there is a way to warp-size the research for the commercial application of decarbonizing technology on the fossil fuel industry, bring it on, because that's what we need. And I don't say so tongue-in-cheek, because I'm conscious that there are many countries in the Caribbean now and in Africa whose capacity to finance their development was premised and may still be premised on the fossil fuel industries. But the reality is that if we want that to help be part of the equation, then we need to make sure that the technology that will decarbonize the emissions is in fact applied at commercial scale. And there are aspects of it out there, just not yet rigorous enough. And in the same way that we saw the warp speed with the vaccine research in the pandemic, that is the kind of approach that we now need with respect to the technology. Similarly, we need a global agreement on methane. Methane has 80 times the negative consequences of carbon. Carbon, however, stays in the atmosphere for hundreds of years, whereas methane originally and by itself, will leave after 12 years. How do we do it? Every time a company flares gas, it is losing money and it is hurting the atmosphere. Every time you fail to fix a gas leak in your pipelines, you are doing the same. So let us have an agreement. Make more money by stopping the flaring and fixing the leaks, and at the same time save the atmosphere and the environment from the negative impact of methane gas. Change the manner in which we pursue livestock farming and rice paddy farming, as is beginning to happen. And let us find new practices to inform waste management in our various countries. The reality is that if we do that, the scientists tell us we can actually reverse the temperature by 0.5 degrees, rather than seeing the continued forging onward. And therefore, if we can, while disagreeing on the causes of the climate crisis, meet to discuss progress on just those two areas without prejudice to the conversation that we must have, and I'm coming to that, on the financing of global public goods, then I truly believe that we will not waste our time in the next few years. We don't need to agree on every single thing to make progress. And a practical foreign policy will allow us so to do, while each defending their own turf and beliefs, but finding the common purpose that we have as members of humanity. Secondly, we need to recognize that if there is going to be a move away from global trade and globalization generally, then there ought to be a recognition that regional blocs will take on more and more prominence. And it is against that backdrop, therefore, that the commitment to this thing called CARICOM is absolutely and utterly important for us as a region. It has not escaped me that after the demise of the Federation and as a transition from CARIFTA, it was Michael Manley who in 1973, then having not been a part of CARIFTA in the 1960s when Antigua, Guyana, Barbados and Trinidad signed the Free Trade Agreement, that it was Michael Manley who brought Jamaica into the Caribbean community with respect to the Treaty of Chaguaramas on the 4th of July 1973. In reading the book again, I was reminded of the fact that that date also had more significance because it was the birthday of his father, Norman Washington Manley, for whom the other heads of government felt there ought to have been some privilege accorded to him for his successful relationship with the Montego Bay Conference of 1948, which is seen as really the forerunner of the early days of integration in this our Caribbean community. But what would love look like today? Love for him was coming together to carry on through a market that was bigger than Jamaica in the form of the Caribbean community, which was initially started as a free movement of goods, an area in which the free movement of goods would be started, but which over the decades, and Prime Minister Patterson, I pay tribute to you, and Prime Minister Arthur, who, along with then President Jagdeo and a few others, Prime Minister Manning, were the principal architects of the modern, not at the time of signing, but the actual execution of the CARICOM single market and economy, and the extraordinary burden of removing over 400 obstacles to the doing of business between our countries and discriminatory treatment in a short period of time. Europe took decades, and yet we give ourselves a very, very hard rap for taking as long as we did, but we were much quicker than most would have expected. But what does love look like today? We've added since then security as a fourth pillar, and we did that coming out of Cricket World Cup when we realized, and Peter, I accord the tribute to you, we worked together then to prepare the region for security cooperation at a level never seen before in the independence movement of our region. And that led to security becoming the fourth pillar of the Caribbean community. Today, however, there is still work to be done. And were Michael Manley alive today, I believe that the recognition that the most important aspect of economic development that we have not addressed in our community relates to the issue of energy. And for whatever reason, it was left out then. Not just in terms of energy as fossil fuel energy, but energy in terms of the tremendous potential that we have as a region with respect to renewables. I believe that the region can no longer pursue this independently, country by country, looking and hoping to capture the attention of a small company here, or a small thing there, or a small thing there, but that there is power in having the audit done, which I've asked the International Financial Corporation to undertake for us, as to what is truly the renewable energy potential of the Caribbean community. And to determine as heads whether not only should we be embracing this within the context of the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas now, in a way that it was left out before, but secondly, to be able to allow us to have greater geopolitical negotiating power in seeking to find a single offtake agreement for the renewable energy potential of the entire Caribbean community. This can be done without compromising the integrity of individual investments in each territory, because there are legal modalities such as segregated cell companies that allow a single company with segregated cells which have immunity against the contagion from any other investment in any other cell. But it will require a mindset change that is recognizing that only in solidarity will we command the power and capacity in this new world that is unfolding. We don't know what it will look like. Only in coming together will we give ourselves the best possible chance to fight not only the climate crisis, but the international economic instability that is coming as a result of the many other polycrises. So pooled investment beyond functional cooperation ought to be a methodology employed by us as a community. In the same way that during the pandemic, we learned the hard way that when no one would even look upon us to offer us a ventilator or vaccines or anything, because it was the wild, wild, wild west, quite frankly, when no one would do it, the African Union and the Afro-Exim Bank stood up to the plate. And I remember chairing CARICOM as I was then, working with them to ensure that a country as small as St. Kitts and Nevis could secure access to therapeutics, vaccines, and equipment at the same price as a country as large as Nigeria. And equally, that India would then have responded, as we have celebrated recently with Prime Minister Modi's visit to the region, in being able to see us and feel us and hear us and give us when others who perhaps had deeper relationships failed so to do. I believe, therefore, that the concept of pooling, which is really a relation to functional cooperation, has to be embraced more vigorously by this Caribbean community, and that there are a number of common problems that most of us face. All of our countries, with the exception of Haiti, are underpopulated, declining and aging populations. In Barbados' case, 1 in every 2 people predicted by ECLAT will be over the age of 65 by the year 2050. Unsustainable. In the case of Trinidad and Jamaica, it is expected to be between 37% and 39% for the 2 countries. Unsustainable. And this is one area in which the region ought to be coming together to make collective decisions, because without people, you cannot sustain the level of growth that is necessary for us to adapt and to build resilience in this fight against the climate crisis that is going to take more and more lives and livelihoods away from us. I pray that we will find and summon the courage, but for me, that is the voice in my head that I hear from Michael Manley with respect to how love is interpreted and built out to ensure that we protect as many lives and livelihoods over the course of our future by recognizing that the way we built, the way we dealt with drainage, the way we dealt with roads, the way we dealt with public infrastructure, all of these things will now change because of the manner in which the climate crisis is unfolding upon our nations. Similarly, that we must try to negotiate all of this, as I said, with a very difficult foreign policy environment. And it is easy and perhaps attractive for some, and we will have to find tactical ways of dealing with it. But I have a very simple approach, that if we are going to say that you can't speak to one and you can't speak to another, then let it apply to all countries of the world. But to the last time I checked, everybody who is a mighty power speaks to everybody, even when they are at war. And therefore, the Caribbean region must retain its options always to maintain communication and to find the best opportunities for our development, because no one is giving us anything to help ourselves. And if we don't understand that it is self-reliance to build resilience, then we better wake up and smell the coffee fast, 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 because that is going to be the only way. This book speaks to resilience and self-reliance, and many of you know from hearing him directly that that was a central core philosophy, because in recognizing that you want independence of spirit, that you want to be friends of all and satellites of none, as Barbados defined its foreign policy to be in 1967 in the first address to the UN, that it means that you have to give yourself the capacity to defend that with dignity. Doesn't mean we will agree on everything, but it does mean that we have the right to communicate with whomsoever we please and on the terms that we believe to be appropriate to guide that level of communication. I want to suggest that one of the things, however, that we need to do is to turn inward and to see how best collectively we can work together to develop that regional self-reliance. Domestic resource mobilization is absolutely critical. And unless we can find a way of financing those resilience building activities, they're not going to happen. That is why my country settled earlier this year a National Investment Resilience Plan for the next decade, because unless we have clarity as to what the public and the private sector must both do to build out those bridges of resilience, they will not happen. We have in the region a level of savings and excess liquidity that is there, in many instances earning at an interest rate much less than inflation. In my own country, a ridiculous amount of 0.1%. In the case of Trinidad and Tobago, 0.5%. In the case of the Eastern Caribbean states, 2%. In Guyana, 2%. And in truth and in fact, divisions over who should finance a CARICOM development fund, which will only reach 200 million or 250 million, really ought to be put one side and a singular focus placed on how do we unlock some of the savings of the region to help finance the resilience and the development of the region while giving people a better interest rate on their savings. It may mean deconstructing a few rules and reconstructing and putting some additional guardrails in place. But it cannot be beyond the governors of the central bank and the ministers of finance of this region to ensure that our region's people have a better chance at earning on their savings while giving us the opportunity to finance a portion of our development as we seek to build resilience and develop adaptation plans. The truth is that we will have to do so with haste. But when we do so, and in the case of Barbados, Trinidad and Tobago, the OECS and Guyana, last week we realized that among the groupings in the Southern Caribbean, the excess savings are, and excess liquidity, is about 8 billion US dollars. If we were to achieve just 1 or 2 billion of that, it gives us greater power in being able to mobilize the capital that is necessary globally, some of which has obviously to be grant and highly concessional funding. And that is why, and I come to discuss for us now, what is really the benefit of Michael Manley's legacy from the advocacy for a new international economic order and fairer terms for global economic activity and trade, to our own plans for the reform of the international financial system, which regrettably still carries all of the colors and trademarks of the imperial system that existed before the Bretton Woods institutions were established. When they were established, we simply did not exist as nation states. And that is why the Bridgetown Initiative today has been shaped, and it is by no means me alone, and let me say that for the record. We have taken some of the best in this region and globally and brought them together because it was clear to us that we need policy space and fiscal space. And that the notion of continuing to determine what we can borrow and who we can borrow from and at what interest rates purely on the basis of historic GNI or GDP is as relevant as asking me for my blood pressure 2 years ago to determine if I will have a stroke today. Utterly, utterly useless. The reality is that in the 3 iterations of that plan that we now have, we have seen some success. Barbados was the largest issuer of commercial paper with natural disaster clauses. God forbid, somebody knock wood for me, if we get hit by a serious hurricane. It will allow us to suspend all of our debt payments for 2 years and to pay them and bring them at the back end of the loan. It will release liquidity in the vicinity of about 19 to 20% of GDP in that 2-year period. There is no country or institution globally that will give us that kind of money, particularly when nation states are being forced to finance more and more damage, particularly because of the lack of access to insurance or the high premium that insurance is bringing down on businesses across our region because of the high exposure to catastrophic incidents in our region. That the World Bank today, under its new leadership, President Ajay Banga, has now accepted that it will do so and was responsive enough to make changes to it twice in a 6-month period, tells us that our voices are finally being listened to on key initiatives with respect to the reform of the system. That we have today a Resilience and Sustainability Trust at the International Monetary Fund, and that has the ownership of many recognizing that this is the first long-term instrument that is being made 20 years, 10.5-year moratorium. It is true that the one constraint is that it is for those who have a relationship with the fund. And it is true that there is no quota for loss. But it is the first time that that institution has recognized, or any Bretton Woods institution or major development bank has recognized, that vulnerability ought to be the basis for concessional funding and not simply historic GDP and GNI. But does it stop there? No. We believe, and Bridgetown 3.0 says clearly, as I said earlier, there can be no separation of people and planet, and that we need to change the rules of the game. We need to ensure that our voices can be heard. We need to ensure that there is also the capacity to shock-proof our economies because of the scale of the polycrises that we're facing. And we need to ensure that we dramatically increase financing, not just for climate, but for sustainable development goals. Michael Manley would have been on the front line of this call for economic justice were he alive today. And that is why I make no apology in saying that the Bridgetown Initiative is an offspring of Michael Manley's advocacy and efforts for the construction of a new international economic order in the 1970s. But this document goes further, because it is really asking the world to make a quantum leap in terms of recognizing that in a globally interdependent world, we must recognize that there must be a global commons and there must be the protection of global public goods. And those goods are for us to be able to deal with and to prepare and adapt and to mitigate where possible the climate crisis and the loss of biodiversity. Two, as a subset of that, because we are human beings who cannot survive for long without food and water, that we address the issue urgently of food and nutritional security and water security. Thirdly, that we fight the pandemics, both the traditional ones and the silent slow-motion pandemic of AMR to which I referred earlier. Fourthly, that in today's world where there are more and more people week by week emerging as victims of war and fragility, and in our own region, even though we do not have a theater of war, we have, regrettably, the spectacle of being the region that has the highest homicide rate in the world per capita. A totally unacceptable position, largely driven by paying a very heavy price, as I said recently in Barbados, for the Second Amendment rights of the Americans, because of the intrusion of guns and assault weapons that have no place in civilized society. And fifthly, the removal of digital illiteracy and the removal of the inequities that relate to it, starting first and foremost with the absence of access to electricity for over 600 million Africans, and building upon that to ensure that every child has access to some form of literacy that is enhanced by digital literacy, recognizing that access to education is the basis upon which we can secure the transformation and the protection of our societies and this world. And related to that are the two difficult issues that the global commons must recognize and confront. How do you deal with fake news in democratic societies which have the capacity to literally undermine the will of the people, largely because of the power of algorithms and the power of those who have access to be able to shape those algorithms? And how do we find the balance between the power of AI and the danger of AI, which threatens, like Frankenstein, to eat its creator? These are the 5 general precepts for the establishment of a global commons and the global public goods. The problem is that the world is saying, and there's some merit in it, that the developed countries themselves are saying that, especially with the spectacle of war and defense spending and other difficult fiscal adjustments coming out of COVID, that there may not be sufficient public money, as we traditionally know it, to finance these global public goods. Well, fine, if there is not traditional public money available, then let's redesign the system. You cannot tell me that it is okay to say the polluter must pay as a principle, and we simply forget it when it comes to how we treat to the global commons. You cannot tell me that a person who commits a tort is responsible at law at damages in private law. But in the public international sphere, we are not prepared to find modalities to hold people accountable. The reality is that the majority of multinational corporations, as you learned, as Michael Manley learned, even here with the bauxite companies in the 1970s, have balance sheets that will dwarf most of the states of the world that are not the large powers of the world. And therefore, there is a balance in asking those companies who either contribute to the problem or who may benefit egregiously from the solution that there is, to leave a few cents on the table. If this were a chocolate bar, and I asked you to leave 3 cents or 5 cents, you're taking a little piece of the corner, and you really would be asking me, you sure you don't want more? So that the threat of destabilization to those companies for contributing to the global commons is simply not there. But what it reflects is an equity and equity, not inequity, an equitable solution to being able to allow us to balance out. We talk, and Barbados now chairs with France and Kenya, the Global Solidarity Committee on Levies, because we have to find a way, because the world, the climate is not waiting on us to solve Ukraine or to solve Gaza, to solve Syria, to solve the homicide rate in the Caribbean and Central and Latin America. It's not waiting on us. And we continue, therefore, to see the excesses unfold in ways that are now threatening basic food security in the region. Beryl caused crops to go. But it isn't only the multinational corporations, and let's break it down to give you an example before I move on, sorry. Fossil fuel companies can find a way of contributing a few cents in the dollar. Shipping companies who contribute to the greenhouse gas emissions but pay nothing. There is now a proposal that potentially can see them helping to finance, okay, ship owners' rebuilding of green ships, but equally leaving money for what is known as in-scope activity, in other words, coastal infrastructure, to be able to help countries build out and protect themselves and to provide the resilience that we need. Air traffic. We believe that there is no person who will stop traveling because if you put on a business travel ticket or a first class ticket, a mandatory contribution of $25 or $100 respectively, and leave economy without a mandatory commitment, so that people will be asked, because agency is important in fighting this battle. And you ask people, will you pay $5 for domestic or regional travel, or $10 for international travel to help save the planet? So that the people who benefit and whose children and grandchildren will benefit feel that they too are making a difference in the effort to save the world. And if you took it to pharmaceuticals and to pandemic, you would expect them to put their part. And if you took it to digital illiteracy, you would expect those companies that now have market capitalizations in the trillions of dollars to leave a little something on the table so that we can secure. We're not going to make all the SDGs by 2030, but we must now prioritize to build the bridges that will unlock the rest. And that must mean fighting hunger and poverty. That must mean providing education across the world. That must mean ensuring that we have the technical capacity to unfold the benefit of renewable energy while at the same time creating the opportunities for green investment, because foreign capital alone will only make us tenants in our own land, and therefore the domestic resource mobilization and the aggregation of capital is necessary to balance the equation so our own citizens do not become tenants in their own land. I say these things because I genuinely believe that in the same way we saw over centuries the evolution of the joint stock company, in the same way we saw over centuries the emergence of the nation state, in the same way that we recognize that this is the beginning of the end of a current world order, that we have to be prepared to recognize and to determine what are the things that are necessary to secure lives and livelihoods, people and planet, without being wed to systems that are no longer working for us and that were made in the image of people who only want to dominate and exploit. That is the spirit of Michael Manley and the word of love being practiced. I say to you today that when all of that is combined, we still have to come back home to the most basic and elemental of truths. That you and you and you and you and you and me have first always to summon the courage and to look in the mirror and to believe, as Errol Barrows said, in our mirror image. To believe, as Marcus Garvey said, that it is critical that we emancipate ourselves from mental slavery. And we forge the strength and courage to develop the confidence, not just simply to say that no man is better than me and I am not better than any man, because our people now accept that. But come in with those rights now, come responsibilities, because there is no right that can exist forever without a responsibility to tend to the things. A house, this building, you leave it unchecked and unattended for, and it starts to fall. You leave your body unattended for, it atrophies. And we as a region have a duty to have mature conversations, first, to begin to understand how we can reclaim the mental landscape of our own citizens, recognizing, as I did in a CARICOM Ministers of Culture meeting as a young senator in this country 33, 34 years ago, that we will never be able to stop information from flowing in unless we close down our society. It's not practical. So that what we must do is root our people. So that when the gale force winds start to blow, the trees may bend, but they will not break. The roots are complex, and the educational system needs to be transformed to ensure, as difficult as it is, and believe you me, as I go through this process in Barbados, I know it is difficult, because nobody wants to feel as though they are on the front line of change, particularly when the change may have implications for their own household. But in the same way that a person who is a diabetic recognizes that if I don't make that decision to sacrifice a toe, I may make the foot or the leg, or worse than that, the body through sepsis at risk. We as a region need to understand that the price of freedom is also equally the anchoring of responsibility in this Caribbean region. If we do not determine that it is our responsibility, yes, to produce global citizens, but anchored always with Caribbean roots, we may find ourselves simply as another satellite location of someone who wants to shape our mental landscape in an image to support their consumerism and to support their other plans. Guns don't walk, and guns don't talk. The ability to boost our cultural confidence and to change our mental landscape and our attitudes towards work, towards how we treat one another, is at the core of what lies before us now. And if it was urgent when there was broadcasting from overseas, it is more urgent with the narrowcasting that takes place with these instruments that are in the hands of each and every one of our citizens, either directly or indirectly. I hope that we will learn from the language and from the teachings of Michael Manley as it relates to this area. Your country has proclaimed that the extent to which you felt proud and strong, and to which your artistic expression reflected that sense of pride, perhaps emerged more under Michael Manley than at any other period in your post-independence history. The passion with which he addressed these issues is clear to all. But what, for me, stands out is that it doesn't matter how much we talk about it. It is only in the expression of our actions that the true difference will come. And we've gotten aspects of it on the creative side correct. It is true that there are aspects that require greater conversation, because I say all the time, who is the greatest Caribbean artist of all time? And if it was Bob, I never heard him denigrate a woman in his lyrics, and I never heard him promote the use of violence and guns in his lyrics either. So how he gets so popular worldwide? And we have to start to have these conversations with ourselves in a way that recognizes that we are stewards of our landscape and our environment for the time that we are here. I believe that that is not only going to show a benefit with respect to the reduction of violence and the management of conflict, but in the increased productivity and in the changing of our attitudes towards work, and to recognize that work is not a dirty four-letter word, as it was intended to be when slaves were forced to do it without reference to day or night, or pain or pleasure. But work truly is something that can bring dignity, because work is at the core of each person's ability to chart their destiny as individual citizens capable of being able to make decisions, because freedom is choice. And if we can have the capacity to give a person shelter that they can earn and pay for, and food that they can earn and pay for, and the pleasures that they would like, then we will be a better society. But many of these things relate not just to the concept of love or the concept of Ubuntu, I am because we are, the commonalities of that or the commonalities of the principle of covenants that the Jewish people speak of with respect to being able to come together to do things that which neither of us can achieve on our own. This is what the world requires of us now as we search for where this new world order is going to emerge and land. There are going to be difficult conversations. There are going to be impossible conversations and options sometimes. What matters more is our commitment to love, solidarity, and justice, and the building of a resilient spirit that will allow us to march out, just as I can't see the people at the back because of that light. There are elements of how we shall walk by faith anchored in principles, because we simply do not know what next year this time, or even as we saw with France and Syria, next week this time will look like. I want to use some words that stuck with me at the end of this book for us to reflect on. And I say to my own people and to all Caribbean people, if you have not had the pleasure of reading The Politics of Change, please do so. There are one or two things that may not be appropriate, but there is much that still guides us. And if we accept that this is a relay race in the land of relays, then we have a duty, as the Talmud tells us, to recognize that we may not be expected to complete the task, but neither are we at liberty to resile from it. Each generation must make progress. Each generation must carry the baton ahead. But each generation will have doubts sometimes. And that is why I quote these words and commend them to you, as I have for myself. And I quote, "It takes great clarity of vision and consistency of purpose to hold the policies in the face of the articulate opposition through which small but vocal groups try to divert us from our purpose. And finally, in the small hours of the night, when uncertainty and the consciousness of human frailty tend to creep up on their unsuspecting victims, it takes a will of iron to hold to your course and to know that you are summoned by fate to common sense, to compassion, and to unswerving purpose. If the moral purpose of this mission is to remain intact, it must be approached in humility and supported by prayer. Hegel once remarked that, and I quote, "History is the march of God in the world," unquote. Ours, then, is the task to see that the road tends towards justice. My friends, the story of Michael Manley is not just the story of Jamaica. It is ours in the region, in the Caribbean, and it is ours in the global South. His legacy belongs to every Caribbean child who dreams, to every Caribbean worker who struggles, and indeed to every Caribbean leader who dares to hope but remains determined to do. Against that backdrop, I say, let us not honor him with words. Let us make his vision our mission. Let us agree that there is a floor below which no Caribbean citizen should be allowed to go as we build out this region. Let us agree that growth without equity is not growth that we want. Let us say with conviction that this Caribbean region will rise not because we're big, but because we're brave. And because we understand who we are. And we understand what our mission is. And we understand that a people who have been dehumanized and oppressed for decades and centuries have a duty to be able to pay forward in the form of a humanizing influence on a world that is riveted now by man-made emotions such as greed and conflict and war. And if they are man-made, they can be unman-made. Let us stay focused, not because we are rich, but because we labor in a righteous cause. In a righteous cause. And we remind the world that we who represent a little piece of every civilization on this earth know what it is to be able to want to ensure the survival of every civilization and every aspect of our humanity. We do so simply because it will lead us to our best future. And we do so because we have a love for people and planet that requires of us actions that perhaps no previous generation has had to confront in terms of the duality of extinction. Arrogance will cause us to believe that we will not become extinct as a race, but other human organisms, other living organisms, have become extinct in our certain knowledge. We do so believing that civilizations will remain dominant, but history is replete with civilizations that have risen and that have fallen. The only sure thing is that if we take this future, not alone as individual islands, but as Caribbean people, as third world people, as people of the global south, as people hopefully of the global north, as humanity, we will have a true opportunity to sustain life and to sustain livelihoods. If we do it in the name of love. Yes, the word is love.
So yes, guys, thank you for staying tuned up to this point. Thank you for going through the speech of Mia Monttley. You know, Mia Monttley, she's a darling to many. One of the Caribbean leaders who's highly respected. In a speech, you can see that she has delivered a very powerful speech. And she was invited as one of the guest speakers in Michael Manley, the former Prime Minister of Jamaica, the fourth Jamaican Prime Minister. She was there to deliver the celebration of 100 years of Michael Manley. And before her, the former Prime Minister of Jamaica delivered his speech. That was P.J. Patterson, who is the successor of Michael Manley, before introducing Mia Monttley to speak. From her speech, it is evident that when Mia Monttley was growing up, you realize that she was looking up to Michael Manley, and this is evident from the book that she is even having up to date, The Politics of Change. This tells you that Michael Manley did a good job to motivate not only the Caribbean but the whole world, and it's good to have a reading culture just like Mia Monttley, because if she started reading that book when she was still in high school or primary school, up to date, this shows you that we should have a reading culture. Whatever we read helps, because it helps to expand our knowledge. It liberates us. She has also talked about some of the points about some of the reforms that have taken place in the CARICOM, and she is calling on the CARICOM, and not only the CARICOM, the whole global south, the Africans, some part of Asians, the Caribbean and the Latin America, to plan ahead, to be resilient, and to come together in championing for some of the policy reforms, and to be self-dependent, to pull their resources together, especially in relation to the CARICOM. And also some of the financial changes, like the loans should be given based on concession and not on looking at the factors such as the GDPs and etc. In the speech, you have discovered there are some things that she has mentioned. In the start of the speech, she was to speak mainly about love, and just to take you through first, I know you have gone through the speech, but there are some important points that I've noted. One, she has spoken about New World Order, and she's saying that there are some. This is a season of superlatives and the unexpected. There are some things like the climate change, of which she's not referring to it as climate change, but climate crisis. Yes, throughout the globe at the moment, there is a lot that is happening. Areas that used to be dry, normally at this point in time, they are getting a lot of heavy rainfall, floods, etc. Areas that were not used to wildfires are beginning to experience the same. And there's one thing that she is the leader of the vulnerable countries of the world facing climate change. That is around 70 countries, most of them from the global south. And there are some things that she's advocating for. She is advocating for payment of some fees for these polluters. And also, she is saying that the countries that are using fossil can you come up with means of reducing the effects of carbon and methane, and just reverse the temperatures. And there's one thing that I've learned from this, that the effects of methane are very dire as compared to the effects of carbon, because it said that methane, even though it lasts for 12 years, its effects are 80% more than the ones of carbon. And these are the things that affect the ozone layer, leading up to all these climate crises. Also, she has mentioned about pathogens and pandemics, things to do like recently COVID-19, etc. We have been having, like in our region in Africa, the infestation of locusts. These are not common occurrence. It is due to the climate crisis. And also, she has spoke about soil degradation. The soils that are at the moment, people are using them without replenishing. And we should feed the soils for the soils to feed the plant, and feeding of the soil should be continuous. But people are not doing that. They are using these fertilizers over and over. So some of the soils have become acidic. Some of the living organisms that take part in the ecosystem of the soil have been depleted, which is a big problem. We should use especially the organic fertilizers. This is one of the things that is required. But there's a danger, because there are some parts of this world that they have gone highly mechanized, and with highly mechanization, they prefer just using the fertilizer instead of using organic fertilizers, because it's like by use of organic fertilizers, it takes a lot of time and effort. There's also one thing that she has mentioned about the abuse of antibiotics, and she's saying that currently this is, or rather in 2050, this could be one of the reasons of high deaths. There are some medications that were being used in the past, but currently they have been wiped away because of the mutations that have been happening. Because there are some diseases like malaria, people have been abusing some of these drugs, and it is very dangerous. According to me, when I have an headache or any ache, I don't just take it lightly, because it's not just normal thing for me for my head to pain, or maybe to have a stomach ache just like that. I don't take it lightly, and when that happens, I take time to go to the hospital to get checked, maybe to get some tests to know, because there are some stories that I've been coming across of people who were having such kind of mild sickness, or rather headaches or stomach aches, and then somebody assumes, in the end of the day, you will find that when they assume they end taking the antibiotics, just abusing them over and over. And this can be detrimental, because it can harm the kidneys, or can end up causing more harm than good. One thing she has mentioned about the climate crisis, is that we are no longer, we are not the only ones being affected. It is affecting the whole globe, because with wildfires in one part of the globe, there's another part who are facing flash floods, low rainfall, etc. And she has also mentioned that the Caribbean and the African, that is the global South, the Caribbean, the Latin American, the Africans should come up, should come up together, should champion resources together, and should be self-dependent. Also, in addressing the issue of fake news, AI, she is mentioning that there should be digital literacy, so that, and by addressing this, she has mentioned one thing to do with Africa. You know, around 600 million Africans don't have access to electricity, and she's saying that for this to happen is good for like all of Africa to be interconnected with electricity and etc. These are just some of the points that I took over, but she's an eloquent speaker, and I really liked in most of the of this globe. She has won several awards, so many awards, because of she's a champion for global change. So this has been the speech, and it's if you have gone through it, I'm sure you might have gotten some other points that I've not mentioned in her speech. So cheers, guys. This is the video for today. And if you have not subscribed to this channel, do me a favor by subscribing to this channel, liking, and also leave your sweet comment. Thank you so much.